Dr. Benny, I understand that if a reaction begins with only reactants, the reaction will form products at equilibrium. The reaction will reverse if it begins with only products. When a reaction begins with some reactants and products, sometimes it produces more products, and other times it produces more reactants. Would you go over how to determine the direction of an equilibrium reaction based on the initial concentrations of reactants and products? Yes, of course, Benjamin. This is a very important topic to discuss. In order to answer your question, we will learn to calculate the value of the reaction quotient and determine what it means for a reaction at equilibrium. Then, we compare the value of the reaction quotient Q with the value of the equilibrium constant K to determine the direction of the reaction. In the previous example of the decomposition of dinitrogen tetroxide, we have seen the reaction can only proceed in one direction. We either had the presence of reactants or the presence of products, and therefore the reaction had to go in a certain direction because we could not lose something we did not have. However, we can also have both initial concentrations of reactants and products, and we are going to have to use something called the reaction quotient Q to determine if a system is at equilibrium. If it is not, we will compare Q with K to determine which direction the reaction is going to go to reach equilibrium. Okay, how do we calculate the reaction quotient Q? Easy. When we calculate the value of Q, we actually calculate the exact same way we calculate K. The reason for the different labels is because we do not know if we are at equilibrium. Therefore, we cannot call it an equilibrium constant. So we call it Q, which stands for the reaction quotient. Notice that for the decomposition reaction of dinitrogen tetroxide, we can write the reaction quotient, the concentration of nitrogen dioxide squared over the concentration of dinitrogen tetroxide. I can then calculate the value of Q and compare it with the value of K to determine which way the reaction will proceed. The first example we will look at is when Q is less than K. What that tells us is that the value of Q needs to increase to 10.4 in order to reach equilibrium. And for Q to increase, we need the concentration of nitrogen dioxide to increase and the concentration of dinitrogen tetroxide to decrease. As a result, that means the reaction will proceed in the forward direction and produce more products. On the other side of the spectrum, when Q is greater than K, the reaction will behave just the opposite. Our numerator is too high and our denominator is too low, so the value of Q needs to decrease to 10.4 in order to reach equilibrium. Therefore, the amount of nitrogen dioxide needs to decrease and the amount of dinitrogen tetroxide needs to increase. And when that happens, we will see that the value of Q will reduce and it will continue until the value of Q equals the value of K. If we calculate the reaction quotient and find that Q is equal to K, then we know we are at equilibrium. Now, remember we are in dynamic equilibrium. Reactants are still going to products. Products are still going to reactants. However, the rate of those two reactions are exactly the same. That is what we mean by that dynamic chemical equilibrium. Can you calculate the value of Q for the three experimental conditions? Not a problem. For the first experiment, the initial concentration of nitrogen dioxide is 0, and the initial concentration of dinitrogen tetroxide is 0.1. The value of Q is equal to 0 because we have 0 squared over 0.1. Since Q is less than K, the value of Q needs to increase to reach equilibrium. Therefore, the reaction will proceed in the forward direction, creating more products. For the second experiment, the initial concentration of nitrogen dioxide is 0.1 and the initial concentration of dinitrogen tetroxide is 0. The value of Q is equal to infinity because we have 0.1 squared over 0. Since Q is greater than K, the value of Q needs to decrease to reach equilibrium. Therefore, the reaction will proceed in the reverse direction, creating more reactants. For the third experiment, both the initial concentration of nitrogen dioxide and dinitrogen tetroxide is 0.05. The value of Q is equal to 0.05 because we have 0.05 squared over 0.05. Since Q is less than K, the value of Q needs to increase to reach equilibrium. Therefore, the reaction will proceed in the forward direction, creating more products. Excellent, Benjamin. Now that we have figured out which way the reaction will proceed, we will have to also figure out what equilibrium concentrations are.